Ahí, por ética. Mi nombre es Fabiola Velarde, soy parte del equipo de Ferlac Jalisco, trabajando desde el componente de emprendimiento. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este panel, estamos muy emocionados, sobre inteligencia artificial. Les comparto que al finalizar la sesión vamos a tener unos cuantos minutos de preguntas y respuestas y les pedimos por favor estas las pueden escribir en la sección de Q&A que se encuentra en su pantalla. Y también en la sección de comentarios que la vamos a estar transmitiendo en vivo vía Facebook. Antes de iniciar queremos presentarles un video sobre la iniciativa de Ferlac y como esta charla será dada en inglés, vamos a pasar la versión en inglés para hacer el cambio de una vez.
Ferlac Jalisco is an initiative led by BID, Inter-American Bank of Development for its acronym in Spanish, the technical logic of Monterrey University, Jalisco's government, and Sea Mines. The Ferlac Jalisco initiative works through the articulation of academy, civil society, public sector, and private sector in 3 important areas. One of them is the implementation of technological solutions through artificial intelligence techniques to solve social problems in Jalisco. Another one is the advice when creating public politics for the use of artificial intelligence, such as its ethical and responsible uses. Ferlac Jalisco is part of the hubs that have presence in Medellin, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. Jalisco has a unique differentiating factor, the entrepreneurial component seeking to strengthen the entrepreneurial environment in AI through the following activities. AI Startup Acceleration Program, PASIA for its acronym in Spanish, AI Talks, workshops on the integration of responsible artificial intelligence and venture capital, hackathons, and the analysis of Jalisco's environment of entrepreneurship in artificial intelligence. Ferlac, for an ethical and responsible use of artificial intelligence.
So as we said, we're going to do a quick change to English. And I'm really happy to be here with these people who are going to be guiding us through this panel of the power and opportunity, the present and future of AI in Latin America. We have Joab, Kathy, Lucia, and Victoria, and we're really excited to hear from you guys, and I'm going to share Joab the word, so the mic is all yours, Joab. I'm going to be here if anything I can help.
Thanks, Fabi. Good evening, everyone. I am Yoav Schlesinger. I am a principal in the ethical AI practice at Salesforce, based in California in the United States. And I am really pleased tonight to be joined by 3 extraordinary thinkers about AI, ethics, and power, which we're going to delve into deeply. And so I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to quickly introduce themselves and to say a little bit about what they do, how they've gotten here, so give you a little context on each of them before we really go deep, I think pretty quickly, hopefully. So Victoria, do you want to start and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Victoria Martin del Campo. A long time ago, I majored in philosophy and took all analytical philosophy courses. And I also had the opportunity to take some programming classes as well. I've always been keen to science, so it was as if my 2 true loves, technology and philosophy, had this beautiful baby called Python and programming in general. And later on, I got to know AI philosophy, which encompasses not only ethics, but AI epistemology and AI logic as well. So today I'm a tech philosopher at this woman-led think tank in Mexico City called Sea Mines, and a learning community fellow at the AI Montreal Ethics Institute.
Great. Kathy.
Hi, I am Kathy Baxter. I am principal architect of ethical AI practice at Salesforce. Lucky enough to work with Yoav. My background is in applied psychology and human factors engineering. I spent the first couple of decades in Silicon Valley as a user experience researcher, taking a tour through the Silicon Valley, Oracle, eBay, Google, before landing at Salesforce. And I have co-authored a book on user experience research methods called Understanding Your Users.
And last but not least, Lucia.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucia Roches. I am Programs Director at C-Minds. I lead a couple of initiatives regarding AI, focused on the environment, focused on social good. And my background as well is on engineering. I'm a multimedia engineer, and I have been working in marketing a lot. I used to work at Texters a couple of years ago, and now I'm at C-Minds. So happy to be here sharing this space with you to talk about the power and opportunities of AI in Latin America.
Okay, so we've got a lot of ground covered: engineering, philosophy, ethics, design, programming. It's going to be interesting. So maybe we'll start here. You know, Kathy and I have given 2 talks already to the Fairlock community about some of the ethical risks and challenges that AI presents to the world. And I think that in the ethics and AI community, we actually spend a lot of time trying to unpack risk and think about what could go wrong, essentially, with all of our AI. But, you know, it's also useful to think about the power and potential of AI for good. So Victoria, maybe we'll start with you. What are the things that you're most excited about when it comes to the potential for AI in Latin America, or generally?
Well, as you said, we often hear about how AI will bring this regime of government mass surveillance and predictive policing and all of this like scary government uses of AI. But we often forget about the other side of that coin, which is that now we have government data that is clean and ready to use. I believe it has the potential we have the potential to turn the table for accountability, and we can encourage citizen initiatives. I know some in Mexico, it's called like Data Civica, which uses open government data, like to track missing persons. I also know one in Chile, which uses public government data to predict illegal copper and carbon mining. So we actually, as citizens, can use the data like that government recollects for our own empowerment.
Lucia, what about you? What are the positives, you know, in addition to sort of finding missing people and identifying illegally trafficked materials? What other potential applications are there for AI?
I think there are potentialities everywhere, especially in the social sector. If we're talking about education, especially in this project that Fabio was talking about, like Fairlock. If you heard the video, we're talking about use cases that regard school abandonment and understanding the reasons why kids are leaving school at an early age. So gathering all that data and using that data for social good in education is one example. Another example is health. I think that there's a lot of people that know that AI is now being used in health to help doctors make decisions in regards of diseases. And it's basically not giving the responsibility, as Victoria was saying, to a machine, but making sure that we are using that data to improve our processes and make sure that we understand how that data is being used to analyze and then make a decision that is going to help an individual or a community. I could name a million examples. Mobility, we are talking about climate change, right? We can put sensors in different parts of different natural reserves to understand a little bit more how ecosystems evolve in that specific reserve and predict or prevent the downfall of that ecosystem. We are using AI for businesses, not only for social good, but also in terms of businesses. I'm sure you at Salesforce use AI in your own company. And that's also something that like more than 80% of large businesses in Latin America are already using AI, which is a very statistical fact that I found a couple of days ago from an MIT report that was launched like a month ago. And what Victoria is saying is really interesting because most of the people don't realize that their data is what is making the way and the path for all of the systems to be modeled, and then for that system to be impactful towards the ecosystems that they live in, right? So the society that I live in is pushed with AI, with data that I'm providing every day through my cell phone, every day through applications that I use, or where I go to the grocery store, the time that I go to the grocery store, that data is collected by the grocery store, right? So yeah, I see a lot of potential in AI. And of course, it comes with risks, but I'm sure that you've covered that in the last two conversations. So I'm not going to go in depth into that.
Is there anything specific, though, about Latin America or Mexico specifically that those use cases are more applicable or more drawn out, right, for certain things in Latin America, as opposed to just generally where you might see AI have these possible positive applications globally?
I mean, yeah, if that question was tailored to me, Latin America in general has a very large disadvantage as a region in terms of inequalities. If we're talking about economic inequalities, health inequalities, political inequalities. And if we go into all of those political and social issues, economic issues, then AI can either deepen them or it can help solve them or make sure that they are not deepened. So using AI for that is what I think that provides the most opportunity of to companies, entrepreneurs, and people that are using this technology to provide that help and that assistance to communities and to people that are not in a position of power, to say it like that, or that do not have the capabilities of educating themselves because they don't have access to education. So I'm sure that if we use power for good, if we use AI for the power of good, we can make sure that the region advances at even more gigantic paces than now. I don't know if you know this, but Mexico has had, I think, 8 or 10 unicorns in the last year alone. And this was a boom of technology in Latin America. So I think that making sure that we understand how that is happening at this moment, where it's like, oh, pandemic, sure, Mexico, go ahead, have all your unicorns. Like, how did this happen? And that's how Latin America runs, because we're usually people that are very passionate about what we want to achieve and how we achieve it, even with those inequalities that exist socially and economically.
It's so interesting that you talk about unicorns. There's actually a movement in the United States to thinking about companies that are zebras instead of unicorns, because they blend, right, social value and business impact, right? And you think about like the qualities of a zebra as being distinct from that of a unicorn, which is kind of this mythical creature, as opposed to this real creature that we have in reality, right? So Kathy, we work to sort of blend those two realities, right? Business impact alongside social good at Salesforce. What are the positive, socially impactful applications of AI that you see?
I think that my favorite example of AI for good that Salesforce has done is Shark Eye. And that is combining Einstein computer vision with drones. And it's in a partnership with Benioff Oceans Initiative to be able to scan the Pacific Ocean along the beaches. With climate change and warmer waters and changing seasons, we're seeing sharks coming closer and closer to the shore for longer and longer periods of the year. And so by using the Shark Eye technology, we can identify when a shark is coming close to the shore, alert the lifeguards or other staff nearby, get people out of water, and be able to reduce the number of human-shark interactions. But also it enables the Institute to be able to study the migrations of the sharks, how many are juveniles, how many are adults, and helps them just better see and understand what's happening with sharks, again, as climate change and changing patterns are upon us. And that's my favorite example that we have.
Thanks. So Victoria, coming back to you. In our preparation for this conversation, we were all talking about some very specific issues, again, related to Latin America, about the use of data in AI particularly, and issues around data availability, data labeling, and some of those other issues that impact perhaps the use of data in particular ways for these AI applications in Latin America. Can you say more about those, first of all, and then identify any other potentially specific issues that you see in the organization of data to ensure that these positive benefits that we're talking about, so reducing inequality, those kinds of things, are realized?
Yeah, I before speaking about data labeling, I want to take a step back to a new concept in academia, like AI research, called data colonialism, which is used in two ways. The first one is data colonialism as a new social order based on the continuous tracking of our devices and online lives that has created this unprecedented register of opportunities for behavioral influence in consumers, either like through specific niche marketing or just like corporations managing content. And one of the books in which you will find this kind of definition is Surveillance Capitalism by Susanna Schuba. The other way in which data colonialism is being used, which brings us back to a question about Latin America, is that AI and data have created a series of powers relationships between AI colonial powers, usually known as what they call the global north, that deploy infrastructural domination across other countries on their so-called global south. And what this means is that there is like this strict difference between the countries that are designing, training, deploying AI and the ones that are buying and using it. And one of the expressions of data colonialism in this second way could be working in labor forces. We've heard a lot about how many jobs will disappear due to AI, but we don't hear enough about the ones which it breeds. We've heard about so some of the jobs that will be introduced to the market are data labelers. As we know, AI uses massive amounts of data, and in most cases, it is human labeled data, where we match like a word, I don't know, cat, to the image of a cat. It is a human which is the one doing that job. And due to the fact that some kinds of AI require these humongous databases, corporations usually outsource data labeling to Global South, or the so-called Global South. I don't want to pretend that it's like this monolithic thing. And so companies in the Global North will use this labeled data. And when a model goes wrong, engineers will usually say, well, let's buy some more labeled data, instead of what we could do, which is to invest in data label workers and to train and scale them on having better data labeling skills, which would lead to better data labeling jobs. Like having these new kinds of jobs in AI will also mean we have to, I don't know, make some new kind of training around AI, especially given the relationships that are being created between the countries which are designing AI and the countries which do different kinds of jobs around AI, which also like can train it.
Fascinating. I think Mary Gray wrote a book that I think is talking about some of the issues called ghost work, which is talking about how the people who do this work are often unseen forces powering the application of these technologies from the global north, which frankly we at Salesforce sit in. So I think we are, right, to some degree complicit in the dynamics that you are describing, right, where there is this balance to be struck between the creators and the users and the adopters of AI. To that point, Lucia, what kinds of partnerships and collaborations could you imagine might drive better ethical and responsible AI practices, right? Recognizing the incredible power dynamics that Victoria just really articulately identified, what kinds of things might or partnerships and collaborations might be struck to reinforce an ecosystem that supports, right, the emergence of new power from the global South?
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that we touched on the point of global North and the power it has versus global South and the power it has as well. Because it happens, it's the same that happens as well with programming. Most of the people that are in tech know that programming is done most of the times by countries in the global South, and that's because of the price of labor or whatever it is, and it provides all of the things. Or some people also say that the North steals the talent from the global South, which is also very common to hear. Which I don't think is true. I think people leave the global South because of the inequalities that exist there, not because necessarily they're stolen from the North. But talking about what your question, I think that there has to be an intersectionality between all of the different people that intersect between government, academia, and the social society, the people that are in the ground, like the users themselves, and then the people that are doing this AI, right? The companies that are creating these tools as well. I think that the point on responsible and ethical AI is not only that we are creating these partnerships to ensure that everybody's voice is heard, but how we are implementing it and monitoring the systems to make sure that the responsibility of the creation of the systems, the implementation and use of these systems is also monitored by the same users that are, in the end, making sure that this works or doesn't work, right? So let's take, for example, the example of health. If I am a person that has a disease and I go to the doctor and I am recommended to use a system that is going to give me a test that is run by AI, that was programmed by images or was programmed by an algorithm, however it was programmed. And this system gives a recommendation. What happens if the system is wrong? Who's responsible there? There has to be a doctor that realizes how this test was run, what the system sent out as a result, so that I as a patient have also the right result. So I think that the responsibility and ethicality of the use of AI doesn't only fall under the person that created the algorithm or the person that created the system or the sponsor of the system, but also on the person that is using the system and the person that is providing the use of that system itself. And that's why I think that initiatives that are multi-sectorial are so important. I think that if we can make sure that we are talking with all of these different branches, if we're talking about how the government has a lot of power to fund these initiatives, but who they're funding them with. Is it companies that are only wanting to use this data, as Bea was saying, or make sure that it has like an economic source for them? Or is it used for something that is going to impact millions of people in the end? So I think that's the real question to ask ourselves, and how those specific partnerships can help is, yes, like if you're using or if you're creating a system of AI, make sure that you are connected not only to your sponsor that is giving you money to develop this system, make sure that you're talking to the community that is on the ground, being affected by it. Make sure that you're talking to the researchers that have done a million of hours of readings and writings about how AI systems can be dangerous and have risks. Make sure that you're also involving the civic and social part of the community that in the end have a say in all of this.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Kathy, how, I think what Lucia was talking about was sort of really being close to the people and communities impacted, right? That there's a clear need for the creators of AI to be in closer connection with the communities and people who are using their AI, who are affected by AI, et cetera. Can you think of any best practices or processes that the private sector, the public sector, anyone should engage in to think about how to hear from the voices of the people who they are impacting?
Yeah, being a user researcher by training, I have to give a huge shout out for the importance of ethnography, anthropology, user experience research to reach out and ensure that companies are interacting with representatives of individuals that are going to be impacted by products. I also want to give a shout out to Microsoft. They have a methodology called community juries that is really fascinating. And the goal is bringing in representatives from the populations that are going to be impacted, but most especially vulnerable, marginalized populations, have them be part of the design process. So not just at the last minute, 5 minutes before you launch a project or product rather, do a usability test, but really getting their input, understanding deeply what is the impact going to be on their communities, understanding their values, the context of use is just so incredibly important, but we still continue to see oftentimes convenience sampling. Who are the people that are the loudest? Who are the people that are the easiest to access, rather than the people that are going to be impacted the most? And we've got to change our priorities. We've got to change our resources to reach out to the most vulnerable and marginalized for our systems.
Right, so there's clearly a desire to be in connection with the people who are being impacted. But Victoria, I can imagine that one of the challenges that might be facing Latin America might be just sort of public awareness or general education about AI across, the kinds of people and communities that might be impacted. What do you think is the general level of awareness of people about sort of data collection practices in Mexico? How much do they trust the government or respective entities around their data collection and use? Can you unpack any of that for us?
Yeah, well, actually, a fun fact, Mexico City is the second most surveilled city with video cameras in Latin America, just after, I believe it is Sao Paulo.
Wow.
And so Mexico is famous in academia for the attacks that public institutions suffer. For example, Pemex, which is the oil, yeah, the oil company, national oil company, suffered an attack. Mexico's government bank, also suffered a cyber attack. Like we're a famous use case for cyber attacks on public institutions, but also in a Latin American context, we are used to believe that if we sacrifice some of our privacy, we will gain some security. If we let like biometric data being linked to our cell phone in some ways that will bring us some kind, that will pay off with security in streets, and that would pay off with less extortion or other kinds of crimes. So I believe that there's a difference between European citizens have these organizations as Big Brother Watch, which actually like detains the government from using these kinds of technology because they know like this will have this needs to have more research before a public deployment. But I think in Latin America we're much more open to sacrifice some privacy if we can have some security in return.
That's interesting. I wonder, Lucia, how do you respond to, or react to that? I see you smiling.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
tell me what you have to say about that.
I think that it depends on how you want to look at it. I think what Bee is saying is absolutely correct. I think that sometimes in Latin America, and I'm talking about the middle to upper class, we sometimes say, okay, maybe like if you survey me and I'm more secure, like that's fine. If you put more surveillance in the city, whatever. But I think that the most important problem and issue is that most countries in Latin America do not know how their data is being used. There is no education. Like in my country, in Colombia, more than 45% of people are poor and have no access to clean water, internet. Like, how are we supposed to talk about such a power like artificial intelligence with that kind of inequality socially, right? So I'm very passionate about this because I think that the first step is basic education, right? Provided to everyone. And I think that countries in Latin America are improving in that sense, but the war is still on. Like I was telling you a month ago when we were preparing for this about the national strike in Colombia and how that national strike was such a struggle of power between people that had the tools to fight and people that didn't. And that happens in all the countries in Latin America, and that's like a daily struggle all the time. So if we're talking about education, I think that if we cannot educate people in the more basic sense of learning how to read, learning how to, like basic math, like going into the path of programming and artificial intelligence and making sure that they understand how their data is being used. I know that most people in Latin America use Facebook because they want to see their Facebook friends and they want to stay connected to their family, but they don't know what the risks of their data and how their data is being used, how they're promoting and they're being part of this system that is making a company billions and billions of dollars while they're still without maybe a meal a day, but they're on Facebook because they're seeing their friends. So I think that for me is, my dog is interrupting the point, but you know what I mean.
I have a lot to say on the issue.
Yeah, but I'm skeptic because I believe that's like, I think that if you believe that people need to know how to code in order to understand programming and how data works, it's like saying that anyone that has water in their house has to learn plumbing and has to have plumbing skills, like you don't need to have the technical requirements to understand how this structure works within your environment. So I think data collection, whether it's physical or digital, it's just a fact, and we are aware of it. And like we are underfunded in research. As a region, we know we need to invest more and more in research. And if we have AI in government, this opens an opportunity to another pair of eyes for analysis, for classification, for gathering information about our country, which we don't have. So I think it actually has, like, I'm both like the boldest of dreamers and the bitterest of pessimists around this. I know things can go wrong, but there is like this huge opportunity for us, like, to understand our countries better.
This is so interesting. Kathy, I'd love for you to hop in here because I might ask the question, right, to Victoria and Lucia at this point, like, does it even matter, right? Does my awareness of what is happening with my data give me the power to do anything about it? Right. So like we're talking about, power dynamics between North and South. We're talking about power dynamics between people and government. We're talking about power dynamics between companies and people, et cetera. So in the world where there is power inequality between, or power differential between companies and people, like, does this education and awareness even matter?
There is a great book. I think it's Kate Crawford, Atlas of AI. Am I getting that right, Yoav? She talks about, it's all AI is about power. And we really have gotten into a situation where for tech companies, it's been a race to the bottom, a lack of regulations, a lack of guidelines, and a proliferation of dark design patterns have allowed the proliferation of companies or organizations or government to be able to collect tremendous amounts of data and making inferences about you. Sometimes those inferences can be shockingly accurate. They can also be shockingly inaccurate. And then when decisions are being made based on those, there is no way for you to have awareness of it. There's no way for you to have awareness when your data has been packaged up by data brokers along with inferences that have been made and sold to other companies that you haven't had an interaction with. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things is that even if you say, I don't want to do business with this company because they don't have good privacy policies, they could still be buying data from companies that also don't have good policies, but you just aren't aware of it. So as much as you may try to stay informed, it's impossible to read and understand supposed informed consents, disclaimers, and be able to take control over your data. And so this power inequality over what is collected and decided about you with no ability to change your data, edit it, make sure it's correct, or say, no, I don't want you to have my data. It's just not there today.
Victoria, hop in here.
Yeah, I'm gonna play devil's advocate today, just so we can have fun. And I'm not sure. I would be cautious to say there's a total power disimbalance. Because governments, it's not only due to AI that governments make decisions about us. They've been making decisions about us for centuries. I don't have to say this like to the oldest democracy in the world. For example, let's take judges, right? Judges have been judges for as long as we have had states and civil codes and crime codes. And then all of a sudden we create these AI, which has racial discriminations results against some people of some races over others. And this, you can have two kinds of reactions to this example. One is to say, oh my goodness, AI is so bad because it could perpetuate the way in which injustice, we make unjust sentences towards crimes committed in some races. Or we can say, oh my God, this is such a great clue for us to find our like to have metrics of how race impacts sentences. We can actually measure things now, because if a judge is racist, where does it show? Which metrics do we have? How do we change variables in the judge's brain in order to make him less racially biased? Instead, now we have like this well, maybe it's not transparent, but we can use XAI to make things more transparent. But we have now like this system in which we can pin where bias could be, and we can have metrics in time to measure if we have been like taking better decisions towards these problems. It's more, we could see AI not as a solution but to a problem, but an improvement to a problem.
Lucia, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, I don't want to respond. I want to add to that because I think that's a very good point. And going back a little bit into the part of the power struggles, because I do believe that we have a little bit of a difference. But I also think that is the responsibility of governments to understand how to make sure that we're making public policies to help more people understand how to make responsible AI and how to make ethical AI. So I think that making sure that the public politics that are made are not only made by the government, and is not the sole responsibility of governments, it's also the responsibility of citizens to understand that. And I think that Kathy touched a very, very interesting point on informed consent, for example, right? Like, I'm not a lawyer, my sister's a lawyer, and even she, when she goes into an informed consent page, right, where you're reading all of these things that you're supposed to be consenting to, she's like, I mean, nobody would read this 100-page document that you're consenting to, these terms and conditions that you're agreeing upon, because you just want to read the news on whatever platform, right? So just making sure that we are, as implementers and developers and public policy makers, making sure that we are using a simplistic way of explaining the use of artificial intelligence and the development of artificial intelligence. It's also important. But as Bea was saying, it's important as well for us to make sure that we're using the tools that are available there. And I think that in Latin America specifically, we can, I just share a resource on the chat that is a publication that we released a couple of years ago about how AI can be used in social good, and how that snapshot of these 12 Latin American countries can help in pre-pandemic what was happening at that moment with artificial intelligence in the region. Colombia is the first country in the region that has been doing this public policy sort of like legislation. So they're including the OCDE principles into their legislation on how AI should be developed and should be implemented. And there's going to be laws, and there's laws coming to Latin America. I know that in the EU there is GDPR, which is already like being implemented, and it hit hard big companies, right? Like I don't want to mention names, but big companies were hit hard by that regulation a couple of years ago. And what's going to happen with that when that comes to Latin America? I want people to be prepared for when that happens, especially people that are already implementing AI, right?
Yeah. It's interesting to see how amongst us, we sort of have a spectrum of sentiment in terms of the relative power of individuals, groups, government, society, et cetera, to affect change in one direction or another, right? And Victoria, I'm sort of hearing you say you think that people may have a little bit higher degree of power to affect change with a sort of optimism. Maybe, I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying. Kathy, Lucia, I hear maybe a little bit more skepticism toward the ability of individuals to have that kind of power. Is that, let me check in. Is that fair to say as a very, very like simplistic representation of your very complex views? Yeah,
I mean, I think that we could move, right, Kathy? I think we could move a little bit into understanding what would be saying, and I think that we could also move a little bit towards our point. But I think in the end, like, what matters is how we're viewing that and how are people viewing it as well. not only from us that are in that ecosystem all the time, right? Like you from Salesforce are thinking about ethics in AI and AI all the time because that's your job. From our side is the same. What happens with people that are not doing this at like all time every day? And I think that's what concerns me a little bit. I think that point of view of the person that is a regular person like me and you that is not working in AI specifically, that's the people that I think that should be more that should be more educated, and we should try to educate more in terms of how that AI is being used. I don't know, Kathy, if you
when I look at AI, I do see like this risk to perpetuate an unjust system, but I also see a unique opportunity for Latin America to improve those systems, because it can give us numbers and metrics and like actual data where we can see improvement in time. Like I don't know any other mechanism that allows us to do that. So yeah,
and I think you're absolutely right. Let's take, for example, Argentina has a chatbot in Buenos Aires that is being developed and used since 2007. It's called Boti,
Yes.
the app of the city. And it basically helps citizens understand where to park, where there is parking spaces, and there, a lot of like digitalization in government trámites. How to say that in English? I'm sorry. My brain at this time is already a little bit dead. But I think that there's a lot of examples as well of how to use AI for social good in Latin America. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying that we should be very careful on specifically that, right? Like how to mitigate the risks of social unrest or further social unrest through the use of these systems. And I think that, yes, making sure that we're doing it, right? Ferla Jalisco has these amazing projects where we're piloting how to use artificial intelligence for helping people that have diabetes not go into the risk of going blind because of diabetic retinopathy. It's just, I'm a little bit on the edge, you know, like maybe we should be careful with that, especially based on the history of Latin America and how that specifically from the politics standpoint and economic standpoint, that difference is very different.
So Kathy, as governments and companies sort of undergo this digital transformation, right? Thinking about moving from, paper to digital, and the digitalization and AIification, I just created a word, of everything. What are, the right kinds of guardrails that should be put in place to ensure that we don't see the harms that we can imagine, right? So how do you create policies, procedures, infrastructure, regulation, whatever it is? What are the necessary building blocks as guardrails for that digital transformation?
I had to unmute myself. Yes. The World Economic Forum published a toolkit for the public procurement of AI. And when I finish speaking, I'll find that link and put it in the chat. I've been putting links, and Lucia put in a link as well. So definitely check out the chat for some additional reading. They provided some guidelines for public sector or government in the procurement of AI systems. And so thinking through, first and foremost, is this something that you should apply AI to? Just because you've added AI into it. I don't know if this is a saying in Latin America, but in the US, they often say bacon makes it better. Like just sprinkle a little bacon on it. Yoa's a vegetarian. I'm vegan. That's not necessarily the case for us, but
oh my God, bacon. I love bacon. I can get what you mean.
So like a lot of people think like just sprinkle some AI on it and it will make everything better. But you know, like lots of paper and pencil and other non-technology business processes can be very biased. And then when you add AI on top of it, it just amplifies, it magnifies those biases and those inequalities. And so, you know, first and foremost, asking, should we add AI into it? Let's look at the data that we currently have. What are the unintended consequences? Who are we collecting the information from? Is it representative of everyone? Is it accurate of everyone? How are the systems going to be applied? Are they going to be applied unequally? So in the US, we see predictive policing systems, and the way the police use that technology to try and figure out where to put resources. The intention may be good. We want to make sure that in high crime areas, we get additional support for the community, but then you can create a vicious cycle where people are targeted based on the information that is collected and used in the decision making. And so there needs to be an evaluation. You need independent auditors to help individuals that don't have this awareness of how do we think through unintended consequences? How do we think through protecting these different communities? And then being transparent. What data are you collecting? How is that data being used? Who is impacted? How are they impacted? And having true accountability. Government needs to be accountable to its people first and foremost. And that can only happen when you are providing the documentation, the opportunity to know when AI is being used and how it's being used.
Lucia, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, adding up a little bit to that point, because I think that there was something that Kathy said very specifically about how are we making sure that people are understanding that the data, and how companies are making sure that they're transparent, what kind of historical data we're using to train our systems, right? And I think that for Latin America specifically, that is also a risk. But there's also an opportunity to make sure that we don't, like, there's a lot of research as well, and a lot of other companies that have done products that in Latin America, as a lot of people are developing new systems for solving those specific social problems and unrests. And I think that making sure that we understand that and then apply some of the tools that are existing out there are going to ensure that we are using AI in the right way for social good, and that we are making sure that we are developing the systems with all of its cycle and monitoring, and making sure that we are gathering the feedback, and that we are deploying a new version of that same system with improvements. So I think that talking about that government responsibility, which I agree with Kathy on, I think that government is responsible and accountable to its people. Like, from the moment that you step into the public sector role, you are responsible for what you're doing, and at all times. So there is a very specific example that I can think of. I think it's Amsterdam. The city of Amsterdam has a tool that is from the government. That is from the government, where they use this tool to keep accountable some of the things that they're using. So, for example, like monitoring in the streets, they use AI systems for it, and they keep their people aware of what's happening with the images that they take, for example, or the data that they collect and how they're using that data. So making sure that we implement those things as well in countries in Latin America. For example, Buenos Aires, with this amazing tool that they have, they do it. They do a report every year where they say, okay, this is the data we collected, this is how we used it, this is how we're helping, this is the impact that it's having, this is how it did not work, and this is how we improved it for next iteration, right? And understanding that also most AI systems and algorithms are live. They're not a program that you created and you launched and you went to sleep and you got over it. No, like you have to iterate. And I think we can talk more about this because that's also something that I think a lot of people have the misconception on AI, that you pay a developer to develop that algorithm and we're ready to go and be entrepreneurs in AI and we are the hot topic because we're using artificial intelligence, not realizing that is very irresponsible to think that way, to think that once you developed, you don't have to do anything more with it. So I don't know, V, if you want to add up to that a little bit.
Yeah, just like echoing your point, we talk about government accountability. And I want to ask you, how does that look like? Because yeah, maybe, I don't know, predictive policing might be a huge risk, but which is the alternative? You know, like random people making chaotic decisions about resources, you know, and maybe these can lead to corruption in a way AI in blockchain, well, maybe it's a much more difficult process to make this like something just and resourceful and helpful for citizens. But if we want accountability, we need metrics and we need measurements, like so we can ask for better decisions. And AI brings an opportunity to study those decisions. We actually know how they are being made, instead of this other alternative, which is random people making random decisions and on public resources. So I mean, I would not leave our justice system to a machine, but I do believe we could be a robotic corporation.
It could be assisting the system. Totally. And also to touch on another of Kathy's point that she was talking about, I agree completely that is not tech solutionism. We shouldn't fall into tech solutionism where we're thinking that everything can be solved by technology. I think that there is a lot of other alternatives as well for different types of problems. I think that we need to understand the problem in depth as well to make sure that we, as she said, we have the data correct, we have the correct data, we understand the risks that it entails, the financing that it entails, because creating AI is expensive. Also, the environmental risks that come with developing and deploying AI, right? Like a lot of people maybe don't know this, but the use of artificial intelligence is having a toll on the environment, and how we can mitigate that toll, making sure that we're not just using AI and deploying AI just because. I think that's a very good point that you touch upon.
This is so great. And we're going to need to wrap up eventually, even though we could stay here for hours. But here's what I want to encourage you. Those who are watching on Facebook Live, feel free to put questions up and we will address some to the panelists. If you're watching here on Zoom, please also feel free to put questions in the chat. I'm going to ask one more question to each of you, and then hopefully we'll get some questions from our attendees who I'm sure have been sparked with lots of questions based on all the things that you all have shared tonight, because it's so interesting. So one last question before we go to some others. For each of you, you know, we've tried to unpack many of the dynamics around power and accountability, transparency, et cetera. If you could encourage people leaving tonight's conversation to do one thing after this conversation, when they go home tonight, tomorrow, next week, what's the one call to action you would have each person take away or do as a result of this conversation? Kathy, why don't we start with you?
So this really is going to take a holistic approach. It's going to require consumers and citizens demanding that companies be responsible with our data. They stop using dark design patterns, that our governments put regulations in place that bring a halt to this race to the bottom and profits by any means necessary. It's going to take those of us that are working in the tech industry to ensure that we are working for companies that are giving back to the community in not just financial ways, but that they are creating products that are in line with the society's values. We can name a number of companies, I think, off the top of our head whose practices we may not agree with. And the CEOs or the founders of those companies, they may set the tone, but they don't write every line of code. They don't design all of the UIs. It takes a massive, massive number of employees to be able to do that work and create the products that collect the data and track us, surveil us, try to manipulate and nudge us, and all of the other terrible things. So we really need to take this from both sides of the creators as well as the consumers and citizens.
Great. Lucia, what about you? What's your one call to action for everyone?
So I think I've talked about this during this hour, but I would say like try to educate yourself and help others get educated on it. I think that one first good step is going into Google and typing what is ethical and responsible AI. There's a million resources out there that you can check on. And I think that there is another thing that I would say, and it's try to find the problem and see if it could be resolved with AI. Like that exercise, I think it's pretty cool to see if there's something that you see that you're not happy with in your country, in your city, in your community, and how it could be resolved with AI. As Kathy was saying, like it takes a village to create AI and to develop and implement it and monitor it. But I think that it always comes from an idea. So if you're an entrepreneur, I would encourage you to seek a problem, see if it's possible to resolve it with AI, and give it a try.
Thanks. And Victoria?
Over the last 3 years, Latin America has undergone a private regulation revolution. Countries such as Ecuador and Salvador, which had no privacy regulation whatsoever, passed their privacy regulation laws nearly like a year ago or so. And we do need to talk about AI eventually, but the basis for those policies lie on the privacy law. So I would encourage people like to look up their privacy, the privacy law that is been passed in their country. And for example, I know Argentina has a really good privacy law, and Uruguay, their law is amazing. For example, you cannot have personal private data outside of the state territory. And I believe that's a really good practice that might not be one that is being deployed on the global north. So we do actually have like good privacy regulations in Latin America. And I would also encourage you to look like, what do you want that law to look like? I have a special place in my mind for students. No Latin American country has specific privacy laws for underage children or students. And I believe this is a problem we have to advocate for, and we have to create consciousness around it. But maybe you can see something that I don't see a lack of in these regulations. So the first step is to get to know our privacy regulation in our country. And the second one is to ask ourselves, what do we want that to look like, so we can advocate for its usage and regulation in our country.
Thank you. And that actually is an excellent segue to, I think, a question that we just got from Isita on Facebook Live, which is how do we draw a line between ethical AI and user privacy? So I'm not exactly sure what line we'd be talking about, but it's clear that there is a need, right, to safeguard user privacy, and there are trade-offs, right? And I think this is probably what the question is getting at, with the ability to access more data, right, and therefore deliver better predictive results in AI, et cetera, as opposed to preserving that privacy and therefore perhaps not having as many applications as robust predictions, et cetera, from the AI systems, right? I think that's probably what the question is getting at. So, Lucia, how would you balance those trade-offs between sort of maintaining user privacy and maximizing the benefits of AI?
I do believe it's regarding to regulation. I think that, and I'm not talking about like regulation, like legal regulation. I think that it's more about understanding where that the trade-off specifically, if we're talking about, for example, like governance of data, what are the systems that you're putting in place to make sure that your users understand how AI is being used? If your users agree to that in a simpler way, not 100 pages of terms and consent, but yes, your data is going to be used for this amount of time for this specific purpose. Do you agree with that? And at any time you can be retracted from giving your data for this purpose, then I think that's something that is like, oh, okay, I'm getting your data with a consent and I can use it for that specific purpose. And there is where I am going to be in an ethical and responsible use of artificial intelligence. So I think that's where we draw the line, where we implement those systems and we implement those tools that are making sure that the user's privacy is always our utmost concern, but also that we're using the mechanisms to make sure that we can access the data that we need. For example, we don't need the name of the person to be able to use that data segment, right? So how can we anonymize some of that data to make sure that is helping with our project? I don't know what type of project that would be, but whatever it was, no. So I think that there is several tools that are available online from different companies around the world. There are several principles that could be applied to AI to make it responsible and ethical. And I think that user privacy is one of the most important things that we need to take into consideration. Actually, Mexico and Latin America, most countries in Mexico and Latin America have laws regarding privacy specifically. So just make sure that you check those laws so that you're not breaking the law. And I think that's a trade-off. I don't know, V, I think you
I was going to ask Victoria, yeah. Would you draw the line in the same place?
No, actually, I think I'm more like eager to sacrifice whatever privacy means. I mean, we're all social beings, and as such, we have make each other accountable for our actions. And for example, I don't know, a problem I care about is a problem I am I agree to giving my data. For example, I'm thinking about water. You know, water is a big problem in South America at the time. And if we all have just to quit our right to privacy in order to have a better management of our water resources, I'm all in. And if I am being tracked on my water usage, but also, beer businesses are also being tracked in their water usage, I'm all for it. You know, if we can actually create solutions with this, I would trade my privacy.
I love a good constructive disagreement. Kathy, a question came in here that I think you could probably tackle. Adon asks, do you think that corporations' compliance departments help the progress of an ethical ecosystem, or are they just shields to protect businesses and shareholders from AI regulation? Do you have an example of good and bad practice in AI compliance?
I think that gets to concerns or criticisms that some of this work is just virtue signaling, that there are companies that it's more about managing brand risk and legal risk and less about ensuring that the products that they are creating are things that are really beneficial to society and can be trusted by society. And so this is where we do really have to look deeper. We really need to understand and ask corporations, organizations, government to be transparent, be explainable and accountable for how are they, again, using our data. Are they deleting it once it's done? Do they give you the ability to see everything they have collected and inferred about you? Are they transparent about how this information is being used? So an example, positive example that I can share, and you can take this with a grain of salt, because I've definitely drank the Kool-Aid, as you would say, in the US. I'm a fan of Salesforce. Yoav and I have a very close partnership with our product council for Einstein, our AI platform, as well as our government affairs team, and our ethics compliance. So that's a different organization where that's those are the folks that ensure that there's no financial fraud or malfeasance. They write the employee handbook, those kinds of things. We have a close relationship with these groups to think through what are the right policies. So one example, when we were first working on chatbots, my early user research with customers found that customers wanted to try to pretend that the chatbot was a human that they were talking to. And I would try to explain to our customers, you don't want to do that. Right out of the gate, our chatbot was originally just, menu based. So more like a phone menu. Which of these 3 issues are you having? Pick one. Obviously, this is not a human that you are interacting with. But even once you transition to natural language understanding and generation, it's going to get it wrong. And when the chatbot starts failing, the customers, the consumers are either going to think they're interacting with the dumbest customer service on the planet, or they're going to realize this isn't a human, this is a bot, and they realize now you've lied to them. Neither look is a good look. So we put into our acceptable use policies, some companies call them terms of service, that you cannot use our chatbots to pretend to be a human. And so that I think is one example where through user research, talking to our customers, understanding ethical implications, we worked with our legal department to draw a line in the sand and say, this is not something that we want to allow. I think a bad practice, or a practice that is failing, is for many social media companies that are trying to use AI to be able to identify and stop hate speech and disinformation. It's a very difficult problem. And we found that sometimes companies have gotten it wrong. They end up actually targeting minorities. So when people are using, in the US, African-American English vernacular, their speech tends to be targeted and censored more than standard English is. And a lot of things slip through and hate speech gets through, and you wonder why some of these things aren't getting caught. It's a very difficult problem, but it's not one that I think is being solved well right now.
Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to do one last call for questions from anyone out there. But if there are no more, I think this will be a good time to wrap up. I want to offer my extreme gratitude and thanks to our 3 conversation panelists today. Lucia, Victoria, Kathy, thank you so much. I know I enjoyed this conversation a lot, which is something unique to say as a moderator of a conversation, if you in fact even enjoyed the conversation yourself. So thank you, and I learned a lot, and really appreciate you joining us, your time, your brain power, and all your efforts for more ethical and responsible AI in Latin America. I am appreciative of all that you do. This is the last of our, in this 3-part series with Salesforce and Fairlock, so I want to extend our gratitude also to all the folks who've made this possible. So thank you very much. And with that, I think we will be signing off for the evening. So buenas noches, thank you all, and we will see you soon.
Buenas noches, muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Joab and Kathy and Bea. It was a pleasure to be in this conversation as well.
We hope to see you soon.
Thank you. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Good evening. Bye.